This episode is sponsored by Bark. As you'll discover in this interview, understanding and catering to our dog's emotions and needs is key to success. Bark can help you achieve this because they send a monthly box topping off your toys and treats that are specially designed to engage and enrich your dog's life. I'll have a link below where you can receive an extra box at no cost. Welcome to a truly special episode today. We are joined by one of the most influential figures in the field of animal welfare science. Dr. Eduardo Fernandez's groundbreaking research has reshaped the way both professionals and guardians approach teaching and raising their animals. In this episode, we dive into a broad range of relevant critical topics to our field. These topics touch on the very heart of animal training. For example, we're going to explore the use of aversive methods and their long-term implications, some fascinating moments in the history of animal training, and discuss and speculate on some of the significant barriers that still stand in the way of the adoption of humane dog training methods. Dr. Fernandez is going to shed light on different frameworks that are used in the dog training field today, like LIMA, which you'll learn more about, and we'll explore his published work on the life model. We're going to talk about some of the most common questions and common misconceptions in the field of professional dog training, including the very popular myth that positive reinforcement and related methodologies don't work on all dogs. As Dr. Fernandez approaches his milestone of 50 published works, it is clear that he is a driving force for positive change in this field. Dr. Fernandez is currently the senior lecturer in applied animal behavior and welfare and program director for the animal behavior program at the University of Adelaide's School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences. So without further ado, please enjoy this enlightening discussion with Dr. Fernandez. Leave your questions and comments as you watch this in-depth discussion. Dr. Eduardo Fernandez. You are a welfare scientist, yes? Is that your title?
Yep.
Give us a quick overview of what a welfare scientist is through the lens of, dog training, given that that's what we have an interest on over here.
When we think about animal welfare, we're talking about improving the lives of animals. That's really the focus of it. And typically that means some quantitative approach to trying to measuring, to assessing and improving the lives of animals under our care. So that's under any setting, whether we're talking about homes, shelters, zoos, production animals. We can talk about various different settings where the welfare sciences are applied. So most what welfare science, when we tie that, so that's kind of a general idea of animal welfare. And when we tie the science into that, the welfare science, I've already alluded to that a little bit, we're talking about applying some metrics now. So something to assess the current state of that animal's life, their welfare, and then finding ways to improve that state for the animal. Typically that's done quantitatively. So we measure what the animal's doing, whether that be physiologically or behaviorally, how they're interacting with us can be part of what contributes to that, what we use to measure that, and then we find things that we introduce and we compare differences. So that's the assessment and the improvement. Those are typically the two components.
In our community online, on Instagram, on YouTube, we've been having a lot of discussions on the idea of whether or not aversive dog training methods should be used on the public's dogs, particularly by professional dog trainers. And I want to have you talk about LIMA, which we'll define in a moment. But I just wanted to give a loose example of aversive, just so everyone kind of knows what we're talking about. It's kind of an unusual word for some people. Anything unpleasant, emotionally or physically, that is used to decrease an unwanted behavior. And examples might include verbal reprimands, pushing an animal into a position like alpha rolls, dominance downs, threatening body language, shaker cans, spray bottles, citronella collars, leash corrections, choke, prong, and shock collars. Is that kind of for purposes of our discussion, about right? Or would you say it differently?
We can describe it as something that's unpleasant for the individual, so human or non-human alike. So I often use the term individual more broadly rather than saying human or non-human. I like saying individual because when we're talking about an animal or a person, we mean an individual, right?
Mhm.
So something that's unpleasant for the individual from the individual's perspective, or something that an individual may work to escape or avoid, is often another way that aversives are described. The latter part more starts to get at some of the functional component, the effect on the behavior of the individual. And now we're starting to get into some of what would describe a punisher. But aversives are often used with the intent of being potential punishers, or are themselves punishers once we show that effect.
Throughout most of the 20th century, we see these outdated methods of using heavy-handed methods on dogs. And then it's, been progressively getting, arguably, I guess, a little bit better over the years, where trainers are more conscious of aversive dog training methods, right? And
Right.
so, and I'm going to have you talk about the acronym least intrusive, minimally aversive. This has kind of been a framework,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term, that many trainers
Yeah.
have been using for the last couple of decades.
It's worth mentioning a little bit about the history of training and animal training, and it's also uh, a lot of. I guess I should mention a lot of the wealth. I happen to be a welfare scientist who also spends a lot of time talking about animal training, behavior change procedures. I'm a learning theorist on top of everything else. I come from a behavior analytic background. And I happen to be an applied animal behaviorist who's also a behavior analyst, among other things. When we think about where the history of training, I mean, training, we have thousands and thousands of years of methods that have been described and uh, detailed elsewhere. I won't go too much into that, but when we think about reward-based training or positive reinforcement-based training, some different ways that this has been described, it's a relatively new phenomenon on the stage of animal training. I mean, it's also been loosely described or used in some way, but it wasn't formally described until within the last century. B.F. Skinner himself wrote an article called How to Teach Animals in 1951, where he first described the concept of shaping and how positive reinforcement is used through differential reinforcement to shape behavior. So this is one of the first descriptions of how you can use positive reinforcement for applied animal behavior change purposes. So for animal training. 1951 is when that was written. At the same time, some former students that worked with Skinner, Keller and Marion Breland, wrote an article that was an introduction to a new field that they called applied animal psychology. So both those published in 1951, not that long ago. And they're describing all the things they did. And this stems back from stuff that Skinner and the Brelands did working on a project called Project Pigeon between 1941 and 1943. Skinner got the idea in 1940, so it was tied into World War II.
Now we'll just watch its behavior a bit. It's not doing anything in particular, you see. But I'm going to try to get it to do something. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn.
So that's where we really see, I mean, again, less than a century ago, some of these ideas came into fruition, came into being. And the Brelands have this long career. I mean, they are the founding father and mother of modern animal training methods, which has primarily been reward based, the modern animal training movement. They went on in 1955 to start working with uh, marine land in Florida and talking about using positive reinforcement, these reward-based training techniques. This is the Brelands with doing for dolphin training for dolphin shows, and other marine mammals, I guess I should mention too. And that proliferated across to many other settings, eventually got to Karen Pryor, who was working in the 60s with train. So she learned these methods from people that learned these methods from the Brelands and went on to write a book called Don't Shoot the Dog in the 1980s. She had talked about her dolphin training experiences before that. That again is another milestone in this big movement forward in talking about reward-based training methods. So she talked about the power of positive reinforcement, and I still consider Don't Shoot the Dog, I mean, published what, 1984, 85, something mid 80s, right there. I still consider that to be one of the best books for describing the things you can do with learning, with using reward-based methods for all kinds of behavior with all kinds of individuals. So people and animals alike. That is not a technical book. That is something that anybody can pick up and read. And for anybody that's watching this, that if they want to get a better understanding of general learning and training and behavior management, I couldn't recommend a book more than that book, Don't Shoot the Dog, still to this decades later. So that's, I think, that's what we know about this, really the modern movement, this more formal movement of using reward-based training methods.
I agree with you on Don't Shoot the Dog. 5 stars.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's such a wonderful book. As an undergraduate at University of Florida, I had wonderful professors that taught me courses, people like Tim Hackenberg and Hank Pennypacker, who were behavior analysts at University of Florida. And I went on to spend a couple years working as one of Hank Pennypacker's. He's a very well-known behavior analyst, passed away in the last year. Wonderful human, who I consider my undergraduate mentor. I think it was in one of his courses that it was part of the reading that I got to read Don't Shoot the Dog, as I was learning about behavioral principles from some of these really wonderful behavior analysts at University of Florida at that time. And I went on to be one of Hank's managers for his precision teaching course, where we use these specific learning principles, reward-based learning principles, to get people to learn better, to have to retain more information. So even in education, how behavioral principles have been applied using these reward-based methods.
Why didn't that change everything? We have innovations in the mid-20th century that really show us, look, there are methods we can use that don't require us to be unpleasant or painful or induce fear to dogs, that can allow us to teach much more complex tasks that cater to their emotional state and consider that at the very least. What happened? I mean, why are we still using aversive methods decades later?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, this requires a bit of speculation on my
Sure.
part, and I'm a bit of a quantitative guy, so I get a little more careful about my speculation, but I'm certainly happy to share my ideas. Um, so what I should mention, the part is that is not speculative, is that many of the early behavior analysts, many including B.F. Skinner himself, wrote book after book where he said society is too reliant on the use of aversives, on the use of coercion. There's another term that's used to describe that use of aversives. And we know what we know now about these reward-based methods, about positive reinforcement, about shaping, etc. Skinner even wrote a fictional book about this mini society, Walden 2, where he talked about, here's a society that uses reward-based methods to improve their society rather than just relying on all these aversives and coercion and etc. So Skinner spent a lot of time writing extensively in books like About Behaviorism, Reflections on Behavior and Society, Walden 2, even that fictional take, Science and Human Behavior, talking about the importance of applying these principles to improve society. So that's the guy who started and and is still very much considered the most important behavior analyst ever, right?
Yeah.
So the founding father of behavior analysis.
Anyone who's ever taken a
Um,
psychology class for sure will know Skinner. Yeah.
yeah, right. His take was we should be doing these things in reward-based uh, ways. So why do we see the use of coercion and aversives? And by the way, other behavior analysts went on to write similar books and talk about this. Murray Sidman, another very well-known behavior analyst, laboratory scientist who spent more time than anyone else on the planet that has ever existed and possibly ever will exist studying negative reinforcement specifically. And he went on, so studying negative reinforcement in rats in the laboratory and using concepts like Sidman avoidance, which people still use to this day. I mean, it's named after him. Murray Sidman went on to write a book, Coercion and Its Fallout, all about the ways that society uses coercion, to his opinion, ineffectively to try to change behavior. So, reliant on punishment and negative reinforcement, on aversives and coercion. We've mentioned a couple technical terms there. Punishment, and I alluded to this before when I talked about what aversives are. Both these terms define a contingency, so some effect on behavior, really. And that makes it a functionally defined term. And punishment means that there's some aversive, some stimulus. We don't even need to necessarily call it an aversive, but some consequence that is delivered that leads to a reduction in the future occurrence of those or similar behaviors. So that's a bit of a, I'm simplifying it a little bit, but that's pretty technical term. So it means somebody does some behavior. Let's say my dog barks. I yell at the dog, and barking occurs less in the future. That would be described as punishment. And the thing that I delivered, the yelling, that consequence would be the punisher. I guess we should say positive reinforcement would be the opposite of punishment in that sense, because now we're talking about delivering a consequence, and the antecedent would be the thing that happens before the behavior. So I might say sit, and the dog sits, and I say good, and the dog is more likely to sit after I say sit in the future. So now I've just described the three-term contingency, and that's the antecedent, behavior, and consequence, or the ABCs of behavior and of really operant conditioning. So we can get the opposite of those things. We now have described positive punishment and positive reinforcement, but we can equally describe negative reinforcement and negative punishment. And this is what dog trainers sometimes refer to as the quadrants, right? Which is an informal description, but still a pretty good description itself to talk about the quadrants. The negative means the consequence, it's something that's being removed. And then if it's reinforcement, something's increasing. If it's punishment, something's decreasing. So in the case of negative reinforcement, then we're talking about something being removed as a consequence that leads to an increase in the future occurrence of that behavior. Now, people often mess this definition up because it is a little tricky. It's understandable. So people often describe punishment as negative reinforcement, or combine the two, or say they see an aversive occurring and they say that's negative reinforcement. But negative reinforcement means something's removed and we see an increase in the behavior. The other problem that people run into is because they see something's increasing, or they hear the term reinforcement, they'll often presume something good is happening. But in many cases, the way that people are able to apply negative reinforcement is by delivering some contrived aversive whatever it is, this may be a correction, it could be a shock, a choke, a pinch, a lot of different potential aversives that they don't remove, or they don't remove the threat of that aversive until they get the desired behavior, and then they remove that threat. Even the use of something like a choke chain or a prong collar for dog training. We can talk about delivering a choke or pinch or some snap of that collar to punish some behavior, right? So they're delivering that consequence and we get a reduction in that behavior. But we can also talk about releasing pressure from something like a collar, or that includes releasing the threat of some potential choke or pinch or prong collar or shock being delivered. So releasing the threat by terminating those conditioned aversives stimuli, and then that's what's used as the negative reinforcer. And often people will describe that as negative reinforcement training, but the reality is there's all these aversives, including the threat of these aversives, which are what would function as, and I'll describe that here in a second, as a conditioned aversive stimulus. So we have all these aversive stimuli and conditioned aversive stimuli that are being applied that are punishing a whole host of potential behaviors. And then it's only that little bit, the correct behavior, if you're using those training methods, that you allow to occur that lead to that increase in that behavior. So if people are describing these, and often gets described as traditional or balanced training methods, some of these things, if people are talking about what they're using in terms of the learning principles, they would say, well, I use a lot of punishment and a little bit of negative reinforcement, would be the accurate way to describe, not to say, oh, I use negative reinforcement. No, 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 you're using a lot of contrived aversives and conditioned aversives to punish a lot of behavior and negatively reinforce a very little bit of behavior. And then I mentioned conditioned aversive, so I guess I should point that out. That's really just anything that's paired with the aversive, and that's why I often use the term things like threat, which is also a term Murray Sidman talks about, relevant to negative reinforcement in general. And it's often the threat of an aversive, and that those are the things that we learn to avoid. I often talk about this in terms of things like bullies at school. So a bully doesn't walk up and punch everyone all the time. Often all they have to do is their presence becomes a conditioned aversive, because it's been paired enough with the punching or anything else that they're doing. Or they might even just be able to walk up and go, show a kid their fist or something like that, and be able to control a lot of behavior that way through the use of these aversives. So those would all be considered conditioned aversives. They've been paired with some unpleasant event.
Yeah, scientifically speaking, I mean, you can change behavior through a variety of angles here, including punishment, including heavy-handed methods. What is so wrong with using a leash correction, a choke or a prong, or a shock collar, either as negative reinforcement or as punishment? Why is that? Or should that be avoided? And if so, why or why not?
Well, one part that you were talking about before was, why are these methods still so prevalent? Why do we still see people use them to try to change behavior? And again, that requires me to speculate a bit. And I think it's just, I think there's an intuitive sense that we learn pretty early on. I mean, when we deliver punishing consequences, when they're effective punishers, those actually, we're getting rid of aversive events in our presence, right? So if a dog's barking, if a child's crying, if there's something that we don't like and we yell, or worse, we do something in the presence of that, it goes away. So we just described what an aversive going away, what effect that can have on behavior as a consequence. Negative reinforcement. So being able to make things go away that you don't want, to turn off these potential aversives, conditioned aversives, can negatively reinforce our own behavior and our actions of doing those things. That's part of why it persists. And there's thousands of years of people using these training methods to change behavior. And we have these descriptions, thousands of years of descriptions of people talking about using these different punishing and negative reinforcing consequences to change behavior in one way or another. But it's been in the last 70, 80 years ago when we started to get these descriptions of using positive reinforcement to change behavior instead. So the science of behavior has brought us something, what I think of as better. It's certainly more humane, certainly more ethical to be able to change behavior, but our actions haven't really caught up to the science of that quite as well. So it's, we're a little slow to catch up with that, but we're getting better.
there are some measurable side effects of using aversive methods in many
Yeah.
cases, like mistrust and
Yep. Yep.
fear, anxiety, things like that. And
Yeah.
so I guess the question I want people, because I know a lot of people are wondering this. They're like, look, I know if I throw that prong collar on the dog and I'm forceful enough with my correction, they will stop pulling. Yes, they may be threatened that I'm going to do another pop, and that's why they don't continue to pull, but the dog is now walking fine. So what's wrong? I mean, if they both work, why
Yeah.
would we want to use positive reinforcement over punishment?
The science is catching up more and more on this. It seems like every day, just about now, we're seeing more publications come out about the effects of the use of aversives to change behavior. If we only focus on the change on the change on behavior, then, as I like to point out, punishment works, right? By definition, punishment works. By definition, because punishment is defined as an effect. If it didn't work, we wouldn't call it punishment. It's a functional effect. It's that thing leads to a decrease in the behavior. So if we only focus on the change, and that's not to say it's more effective, but it's just simply to say that punishment is described in this objective, operational, functional manner by its effect. So it requires that we start to think about some of these other components about, and that's where we've over the last couple decades, we've been seeing more and more research and more publications about this. What effect does using some of these procedures, so what effect is using aversive tools, some of which we've mentioned already, shock collars, prong collars, choke chains, what effect do they have on the welfare of the animal, the individual directly? And then another critical component there is what effect do they have on our relationship with those individuals? So, what falls under the broader spectrum of human animal interactions? So, what's our relationship like with a human animal bond? With our dog, and we can talk about this under a variety of different settings. There are welfare scientists like Paul Hemsworth who have talked about this in terms of stockmen and their relationship with cattle. So looking at human-animal interactions, even with production animals, we can talk about it in zoos. So people like Vicky Melfi and Jeff Hosey, and in fact, they wrote a chapter for a book that I just had published, was edited, talking about animal-staff bonds. So the animal staff relationship between keepers and trainers and other staff in zoos and the animals they care for. And we can certainly talk about it in terms of companion animals, and there's a lot written about that, about the relationship between a guardian and their pet. So the relationship between care staff and shelter animals. So that's a whole other component. So we have three different components to look at. It's not just a change in behavior, not just the effect, but also the impact on the welfare of the individual. So that's the second component, and the relationship between that individual and us. And those latter two components are, as I mentioned, over the last couple decades, where we're seeing more and more research. And for those people that like to look at the publications, they want to see what's out there, I always recommend Dr. Zazie Todd has a wonderful website. She has this never-ending list, and it keeps growing and growing, of research that's been published on comparing different on these comparing different methods, including some of these traditional aversive tools, aversive methods, to reward-based methods, and the effects on the individuals, the effects on the relationships. I could go on and talking, giving particular citations, but I think it's easier for anyone watching this to just be able to go to Dr. Zazie Todd's website and look at that long list. There's this growing body of evidence of the detrimental effects, what Murray Sidman would have called fallout. And so what these methods, how they impact the individual, their welfare, and their relationship with us. And I'll just mention one of the papers itself. Oh, Hanley, I want to say 2020. We can throw that citation over there. But they looked at some of the relationship and levels of aggression between cat guardians and their pet cats. One of the things that they found was that cats, this is correlational, but still very relevant, that the people that were more likely to use aversive methods with their cats, things like spray bottles, were also the ones more likely to have higher levels of aggression in their pet cats. And that's obviously going to impact the relationship that an individual has with their cat. So they're using more aversives, and the cats are delivering more aversives back to their guardians, to their owners.
And so this, yeah, that really can get in the way. So while both punishment and positive reinforcement can change behavior, we don't see the fallout, at least so far, to the levels that we see with punishment. In other words, positive reinforcement doesn't contain the risks, and they both can work. So why not go with the one that doesn't have the host of risk?
And the reality is we need more research, particularly looking at doing some of these comparisons, and more research is coming out. So I think it's easy to default to people saying, well, yeah, but we don't really know yet, or yeah, but we need more. So as I'm saying right now, I'm saying we need more research. But as with any scientific field, as with any body of research that we have that exists, we use what we know, and we're able to make statements about, well, this is what we know right now, and there is this growing, overwhelming body of evidence that we're seeing lots of fallout from the use of aversive methods. And we're just getting down to more particulars about the questions we're asking. But if somebody's saying, yeah, but I can use this method because we don't know about this, or that, we know a lot at this point. There's a growing body of evidence that there is particular fallout, that there is particular damage, to be more clear, of the use of aversive methods in particularly these harsh aversive tools in trying to change behavior in our companion animals.
But what do you say to the person who says, look, I think positive reinforcement is great, but it's not for all dogs. It's great if you have a dog that's predisposed for it, but not my dog, or not this dog who's attacking other people or pulling me down. How do you handle that?
Are there things your dog finds pleasant? Because if there are, then you have a potential positive reinforcer, a reward that you can deliver, and that should be able to consecrate behavior in a way that will allow for an increase in that behavior and therefore effective change. So this is I'm empathetic to the fact that why people would think that. I don't want to belittle that. I'm empathetic to the plight of anyone that's struggling with these things and says, I'm not finding anything that works. This isn't effective. I get that. I get that it's tough. I get there are plenty of situations I've gone into where, I mean, I did some ostrich training of all things. And if you want to, I'm very empathetic to the plight of trying to find something that might work to get something going. So that's also a shout out to some of my rat type people out there that might be listening. So rat types are great. But I get it. I understand that. But to say that positive reinforcement is just not going to be effective with this animal is categorically false. There we can find things that are pleasant for that animal that therefore should be able to work to effectively, positively reinforce some response, some class of responses, some set of behaviors effectively. So it's a little bit of this trial and error process itself to figure those things out. And I think that's really what it's about. So, and as we get better at identifying these things, then we should I think that's going to become a lot more clear.
I think I know what they mean. Like sometimes when a dog is over threshold, they don't want to take treats. Sometimes it's about really working with your dog when they're in the appropriate mental state, when you're really focused on the holistic raising of that dog. I think that kind of sets them up a little bit better to be reinforced by something because they determine what's reinforcing. It's not always treats, it's not always toys, sometimes it's environment.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. And that's a really, really important point too. Critically important is that often when people hear this idea of using reward-based or positive reinforcement-based methods, they say, well, I can't just go out there and use treats. But we're not talking about just food. Any consequence that an animal finds pleasant at some level, like we're defining this in terms of the effect, the functional effect. So all a positive reinforcer is something that's been delivered as a consequence that leads to an increase in the future occurrence of that behavior, right? So anything can be a potential positive reinforcer. And as we all experience every day, there's lots of things throughout our day that's changing our behavior through positive reinforcement. So all individuals are experiencing this. We're learning all the time. We're changing our behavior all the time. And hopefully a lot of that is happening through positive reinforcement, because otherwise it sounds like it would be a pretty difficult experience. It's a matter of starting to figure that out. And part of that comes from having these accurate, these better descriptions and better ways of assessing some of these things. One of the things that I've done with a dozen plus different species, I think close to 2 dozen species across a number of different settings, actually on at least 3 different continents. I've done what's called a preference assessment. I've published a couple papers on doing preference assessments. So even doing the science of this, but for just practice purposes, where we've gone into some setting and said, hey, here's a simple preference assessment that you can run that will help you decide, like, okay, pick a few different rewards that you might use. And now we can present these against each other under a few minutes, takes several minutes, one little sheet of paper that I print out, and I'm like, okay, just present these 2 items, circle which one they got, do that 12 times between these 4 items, and now you have an actual quantified effect of what they found, what they preferred at that moment. And there's actually a number of papers, including with animals. Nicole Dorey and Lindsey have a paper they published 2015 or so, where they showed that they asked keepers what the animal would prefer, and then they tested via preference assessment, and they found that preference assessments were more accurate than the keepers. So it's a nice little quantitative, simple tool that can identify potential positive reinforcers for people that are struggling with finding potential rewards. That's a game changer, right?
Yeah, what would be an at-home version that someone could do of that? Like, I'm because
Yeah.
a lot of it is working with your dog when they're in the right mindset, not just throwing them in the deep end and trying to work with them
Yeah.
or something, right? So, what's an at-home version of that? What do you recommend that people do in order to do that?
I think it's just stopping for a second, looking at what's going on, right? Saying, okay, I'm trying to do this, it's not working. And then just taking a second and going, let me look at what's happening before and after.
Mhm.
And sometimes that's where having somebody else seeing what you're doing can help, or video recording what you're doing off, and then going back and looking that, and starting to think and try to break it down in terms of what happened right before, what was the behavior I'm interested in, what happened right before that, what was the consequence, and looking at it in terms of that, again, that ABC, that 3-term contingency, thinking about it that way can really help to start change those things. And if you're sitting there going, well, but I'm using all these different rewards, they're not working. You might start to see that pattern by taking a step back, looking at that. And then that's where you might be able to step in and say, you know what? Here's a very simple thing I can do where it looks like the rewards aren't working. We're not actually positively reinforcing some behavior. It's not working. And maybe it's the reward. So maybe I'll just test a few of these things and try it out. And you could do that in a quantitative manner. You can do that with a very simple data sheet that I've offered, that I've given to plenty of people. I've used this in workshops, really easy to use. You can do it informally, where you test a few different things under a few trials and then say, oh, whoa. And the other thing is that these things are always changing. I know my tastes don't work that way. I can't eat the same thing every day. I can't do the same things that I find as pleasurable as I did the day before, or even the hour before. They're changing at different times of day, different seasons. These things are not static, right? So they're constantly changing. It's one of the other reasons why it's good to take a step back rather than just say, well, I know this is always going to work and it's just this, right? Yeah, that does. That does work under a lot of situations for a lot of individuals.
Mhm.
But what about when it doesn't? So how do you resolve that? And that's part of what we're talking about.
What we're talking about right now is the dog will sit and listen and pay attention just fine in the living room, but when I go to
Yeah.
a park, I now have a new environment. I've
Yeah.
the environment now, which makes it very different, and so I need to be cognizant
Right.
of it and maybe make things a little bit easier for the dog and not hold them to the same standard as much,
Yeah.
or just let them observe and take in the environment, even if they're just all over the place. What do you what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really important issue. And, that's something that in zoo environments, people deal with this all the time because if you think about the majority of the training that you're seeing in these zoo environments is often it's husbandry training that's happening. So when you're working with something like a sea lion, a polar bear, this zoo or aquarium environment, it's often you're training them for some type of everyday care or even veterinary procedures. So you might be training them for something like a blood draw or an eye check or mouth check, procedures that themselves can be not pleasant for the animal, but it's a necessary thing that it's part of this veterinary procedure that will occur, that has to occur. It's for the health, right? I mean, who wants to have their blood drawn necessarily, and now try asking, a 6,000 pound walrus or elephant, something like that. So what happens in many of those cases is they overtrain under these conditions. So they take very small steps. We're going back to the shaping idea. We use approximations. You work your way through this. So you don't just go in and say, okay, here's a needle, jab it into the hippo and expect everything to be super great. It can be a long process of training so that they're willing to accept something like even the presence of the needle. And some of these animals have this history where people have used aversive training methods. They've used grabbing the animal, trying to use pressure in some way, hold them using fear, intimidation. And so there may be that history that you've already got to deal with. There may be some counter conditioning that may have to occur where you're just counter conditioning, simply as I like to describe it as reconditioning. You may have to take something like even the presence of the veterinarian has become a conditioned aversive because every time they show up in the room, something bad happens. And we're talking about, I mean, this is done with polar bears, with Australian sea lions, with New Zealand fur seals, lots of just all this wonderful stuff that they're able to do, that they get voluntary participation of these animals coming up, polar bears coming up and being willing to participate in these routine husbandry veterinary care procedures. They don't get there overnight. So they work on that. They work through these approximations over time. So using this shaping procedure, and they work up to things like here's the presence of the needle. I'm going to apply that without the needle actually going in. So it might just be the case of the needle with no actual needle part on it. I'm using obviously very technical terms now. You can tell I am not the I'm not a veterinarian using the needles themselves. I'm like the plastic part and the needle part. Ken Ramirez, past VP of training for Shed Aquarium, consults still with them, runs Parent Prior Academy and their Clicker Training Expo. Ken talks about overtraining. You work in these settings that you overtrain them before you apply it under this other setting, before it has to actually be implemented. So if we start working with an animal and we're saying, I'm training them to do this. I'm looking at this behavior change procedure under this condition. And now I'm going to take them to a park where there's a whole bunch of distractions and all this stuff. Well, we want to make sure that behavior is really well trained under this condition first.
Mhm.
So those are all some of the ways that we promote the success of these reward-based training methods that we can very easily see a breakdown if we don't take a step back and we think, how are we doing this consistently, systematically, in a way that will prepare the animal and the individual, then otherwise we might see the breakdown in those procedures, and start to attribute that for other reasons. Oh, see, the rewards just don't work. Oh, it's not working. Oh, I can't do that with that.
Mhm.
But we know that it does work under those conditions, and we've seen it. There's plenty of examples. There's plenty of published papers
Mhm.
that show that it can work. So now it's a matter of figuring out how it works for you.
So my understanding is the entire animal behavior science, more or less, community has moved beyond the
Yeah.
use of aversives. We don't see them in zoos and aquariums. Am I safe to say that?
Yes, I mean it for accredited zoo facilities for most zoos around the world. There has been this consensus of moving toward and using as much reward-based training as possible. So
Mhm.
using as much positive reinforcement to change behavior and to get voluntary participation from the animals as much as possible. So yeah, yeah. So that's my little caveat that I threw on that though.
Sure, that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, really, and again, just as a reminder, I think when I'm using the word aversive, I tend to mean a negative pre-planned approach that's designed to change future behavior. And
Yeah.
so I hear what you're saying. The fact that an animal is in an enclosure could arguably be considered aversive. But I know you talk a lot about environmental enrichment too, which is a whole
Yeah.
maybe we can get to at some point.
In zoos and aquariums, these animals, and by the way, we're talking about these same methods applied in places. One of the we have here in South Australia, we have Adelaide Zoo and we have Monarto Wildlife Park, and we're starting to develop some of our future research studies is with the wildlife park. These same methods are being applied where they're using these reward-based methods with these animals that are in these open environments. It would still count as an enclosure, right? But it's a wildlife park. These are large outdoor environments, and the animals are called in, asked to move, to shift on command in many cases. So same kind of thing that you see at San Diego Wildlife Park, also in Victoria near Melbourne out here in Australia. So Werribee Wildlife Park there. So we have many instances of this, and these same methods are working with these animals that having them come, so actually respond to the cues that we give. So they come on command, and we also will have them shift, so move from these different areas on command, and all done using reward-based methods. And I guess it's worth also pointing out for those that may not have been to a zoo that recently, the modern zoo has focused on building these large naturalistic exhibits. So for any accredited facility, that's typically what you see is big areas, and you call them in to work on these behaviors. So it's not like we're talking about this animal has nowhere to go, so they have to come over and necessarily be involved in that procedure. We're talking about being able to use these same methods under all those kind of conditions. So I
That's a
think that that's important. Yeah.
That's a really good point too, because you're right. I mean, we are seeing the widespread adoption of these modern methods. Even with the environment itself at zoos and aquariums and things like that, where they're making more and
Yeah.
more of an effort to cater to the animal's welfare, because that creates a better experience for the animal, and in our case with dogs, a better experience, I would say anyway, for both the dog and the person. So it's no longer the case necessarily that the animal has no choice but to interact with the human. So they have options and their environment is considered.
Yeah, and the choice is itself a relevant component of what we're trying to look at. So one of my, she's an HDR student, so doing her PhD with me who's about to start doing her PhD, Kelly Russ, who is a past sea lion trainer in Mexico and here in Australia. We just published a paper along with Isabella Clegg. It's a scoping review of choice procedures used to improve welfare. And it was surprising how few studies have actually done a comparison looking specifically at choice. But for those studies that do exist, we see how important it is for the animal to be able to have that choice to make some choice, be able to participate in some event, how much that leads to an improvement in their welfare across a variety of species. So absolutely, the ability of animals to be able to participate. And that's one of the key identifying distinctions itself between reward-based methods and the use of aversive tools or aversive methods itself, is that under the use of these reward-based methods, we're giving the animal the ability, what some people might say is their ability to voluntarily participate. I tend to use descriptions like that we give them we're providing a choice to engage in one behavior versus the other, and that's pretty important. We're not that choice is removed from once you start using coercion, once you start using aversives. So I'm going to present the aversive, and what is your choice? You to move away from the aversive. You're not given that option other than to do something to turn this off.
Right, and we established earlier that can have negative side effects that are not in anyone's best interest. A lot of time there are alternatives available, it sounds like. So
Yeah.
all this to say that the animal behavior science community has really dramatically moved beyond a lot of these methods in many respects. But when I look at the dog training profession, we are very much as an industry, it seems like a lot of dog trainers are still attached to, I guess, what I would call an outdated standard. I'll let you use your commentary of using the least intrusive, minimally aversive, meaning I don't want to use aversives, but if I have to and nothing else works, I will.
I get it. I mean, I think we've talked about reasons why people would be relying on aversives. By doing something like yelling or engaging in some aversive towards another individual, you often turn off that aversive, right? So it can be negatively reinforcing for you. I'm empathetic to the plight of just wanting something to go away, wanting to focus on, I just want to stop that. I just want to get rid of that. I get that. I get that at every level, not just for the owner, the guardian, but also for the trainer. So it's understandable. We will continue to see that, right? Because it can, especially in the short term, temporarily stop certain things. What effect it has in the long term, well, we don't always know. But at least in the short term, we can get a reprieve from something.
I was surprised as I've looked into this issue a lot more in the last few years to find that this acronym of least intrusive, minimally aversive is largely a standard by many dog trainers, but it doesn't exist, or does it exist anywhere else in the behavior science community outside of this profession? I've not been successful in finding it, but maybe you have some.
Yeah, not really. I mean, it is. So it was Stephen Lindsey who he had talked about it a little bit prior to 2005, but it's really his handbook in dog training methods, that 2005 text where he described the concept of LIMA, so least intrusive, minimally aversive. In my article talking about LIMA and my alternative proposed model for describing these ethical animal training procedures or force-free procedures, reward-based procedures, I talk a bit about that and some of what Lindsey used to describe that. That's why we see it in dog training, right? So we see that it's something that's been described as such in the dog training community. Stephen Lindsey started that, but at the same time, Lima's only just now, I mean, just last year got old enough to vote, right? So it was created in 2005. So it's still a fairly new idea, less a couple decades old. What's interesting about LIMA is that we do see this fairly big separation in the dog training community between people that tend to use a lot of aversives and people that tend to not. People that try to not use aversives where possible and actively discourage the use of aversive tools like shock collars and prong collars and choke chains. So LIMA's been used by force-free trainers to say, oh, it means force-free. And it's one of the reasons why I detailed the history of it itself and went right back to the source and provided quotes that Lindsey gave of LIMA, because the traditional or balanced trainers, and you can find plenty of videos and plenty of writings out there online where they're saying, here's what Lindsey meant. And they're using LIMA to describe a justification of the use of aversives. So what did Lindsey have to say about it? Well, Lindsey was pretty clear in support of the use of some of these aversive tools, and in saying, and in fact, the description of LIMA was the first description of it on page 29 of his 2005 text. On the next page over are pictures of prong collars and other aversive tools. So he was using this as a way to advocate for the use of these aversive tools. And Lindsey, to this day, it actively advocates for the use of and presents at conferences for traditional or balanced trainers and talks about the use of aversives as justifiable tools to be used for dog training purposes. So going back to Lindsey's writings and seeing what Lindsey says today, it's pretty clear he was a supporter of these type of methods, which is one of the things I find problematic about LIMA. There's other things to be found to be problematic about LIMA, including the fact that the entire focus is just on what you don't want to see animals doing, primarily dogs. And I think in general, that's been part of where we see some, again, getting into my speculating part, where we see some of this problem in the history, and why we still see this considerable use of aversive methods, is that people pick them up, they're proliferated, and they're easy to promote, and people aren't going and seeing what the science has to say necessarily about this. I mean, how many people are going to read one of my published papers or somebody else's published papers, and they're not being told about what we're finding out about these methods? And then we have models that are being promoted like LIMA that continue to allow for, at least at some level, the justification of these tools. So I think that that's a bit problematic. And part of the way that we continue to progress forward is by changing what we're doing, how we describe what we're doing. So that was really a big part of my intent in describing this alternative model to LIMA, was giving people an option to say, this is, I actually am saying, let's focus on reward-based methods. Let's focus on things that we want to see the animal doing and talk about what is functional and effective for the animal, so functionally effective, and hence the alternative, which also made a nice little acronym, which was least inhibitive, functionally effective, or the LIFE model.
So just to summarize for those who might not be really familiar with it like you are. So LIMA is basically comes on the scene early 2000s, and it's you described would use these positive punishment methods a lot and aversive methods on dogs. And so over time, LIMA comes to mean something different as positive reinforcement methods and related methodologies continue to impact the industry, right? It comes to mean instead of like going from a choke chain to a prong collar to a shock collar, you now are going to really try to avoid aversives. However, you still have to keep on the table the idea that maybe you might need to use an aversive on these dogs sometimes. Now, and that is now falling out of favor from my perspective, based on what I can tell, that aversives are almost like saying that, well, maybe smoking a cigarette will cure lung cancer. We can't say it won't, but it's not exactly,
Yeah.
it never addresses the underlying cause. The issue with Lima for me as a dog trainer and just looking around and seeing how fellow professionals and the public is impacted by this, it seems to unnecessarily confuse professionals and the public, because you'll hear
Yeah.
many people say, and experts in the field say, "Look, I don't think we'll need to use an aversive, but I need to be scientific here, and I still need to keep it on the table." And if we look at the 2021 AVSAB statement, at least according to the Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior and the ACVB, to my knowledge, no, aversives should not be used in animal training because they don't address the cause.
You're really catching some of the problems with Lima itself. I mean, that's part of what I address is some of as I mentioned, you talk to different trainers from different camps, and they're going to tell you that Lima means very different things. And that is a big part of the second point that I talked about in my paper about Lima is that it's not just ambiguity in some of the terminology used, but in the concept itself. And so it's not clear necessarily what it means to say, well, I'm just going to be least intrusive, minimally aversive with what I do. As you pointed out, it at least means these options are still on the table. But then the question becomes, okay, but when is that option being used? That when you hear people say, well, it's the last ditch effort. Okay, but when do you reach that last point? So all we can say is it's necessarily still on the table. And then also, it's ambiguous enough that some people have said, no, 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 it's not on the table at all. Lima means force free. It means it's not on, but that's not how it's being described, nor is it what was very clearly Lindsey's intent. So I think that as a model, as a way to describe a force-free approach, that can be a bit problematic.
You published a paper last year, right? It was like
Yeah.
September, October.
Beginning of this year. Beginning of this
Oh,
year.
did it?
So
It was just this year.
the first presentation that I gave that was related to this paper was just over a year ago, was June of 2023, where I presented the life model. And then the paper was published in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior in January of this year.
It's made huge waves in the positive reinforcement community, especially as, shedding a lot of insight, because you raise these points about Lima, the issues that there are there. Can we come up with something to better articulate?
The model is really, I mean, the approach, and you can use any of this interchangeably. The model approach, the framework. This was okay. Here are some critiques I have of Lima, what this is. At the same time, acknowledging that Lima has served an important purpose within the force-free training community itself, and getting us to having something easy to describe, getting us uh, to this point, but that it's worth acknowledging these criticisms. And those three big criticisms itself were some of the terminology used. That intrusive is not a very behaviorally friendly term. Most behaviorists have tended to use other terminology like restriction or inhibition to talk about things to avoid in that way, because it's very clear what effect that has on behavior. But that's one of the small points. It just happens to be why I replaced part of the acronym. Lima also doesn't really tell us what we want an individual to do, and that's a really important point, is let's focus on the things that we do want to see happen. So if you go into a home setting, if you're working with an individual and they say, you know, I don't want to, my dog barks too much. He jumps on the couch. He does all the long list of all the things that they have problems with. A very nice way to redirect is simply to say, okay, what would you like them to do instead? And Lima gave us nothing directly in terms of that. So I wanted to be clear that that was part of the model itself, and especially in, just as you pointed out, in identifying the cause of some behaviors, identifying the function, to better be able to intervene effectively on it. Because, and that's part of that last component that I said is the functionally effective part. It's not enough to just simply say, okay, well, I'm successful, and then therefore this is a good method, right? If that's our standard of a good method, well, there's lots of things we can do to succeed. but rather we have to tie the component of understanding why something occurred, the function of some behavior, and then being more likely to effectively replace it and find something to reward. So that was really, that last part is the big part, what I call that functionally effective component. And that's the main point of the model, is doing things like offering choices, um, focusing on behavior we do want to see, and making sure we understand the function of some behavior when we do want to change it in some way, particularly if we want to try to get rid of or reduce some behavior without the use of punishment. How can we effectively do that? We find other things to increase. So we differentially reinforce something else. So we found an alternative or incompatible behavior to reward. Worked with a bunch of individuals that really helped with its creation. So Lauren Novak, Mara Velez, a number of different individuals from the Shelter Playgroup Alliance really helped contribute some of the early feedback before the paper was even submitted. And then Lily Chin offered her services to help create some of the graphics. So we have these wonderful, really pretty graphics that, because Lily's an amazing artist who's done lots of wonderful stuff and drawing pictures of animals. She's also drawn pictures of penguins for me. So that just made her forever my friend. And she contributed some of the artwork to the paper. So we have really nice graphics and some simple descriptions in it itself, that you can see that talk about how to apply the model. A big part of what I'm advocating for with this model is a connection to the science. And that connection to the science for this ethical animal training model necessarily means not just the behavioral sciences, not just how behavior changes, but those two other components, the welfare sciences, so what it means for that individual's life, their quality of life, and then our relationship with that, with those individuals. So the human animal bond, human animal interactions. I only briefly alluded to that last part, the third part, the human animal interactions, in the paper. And it's something that I hope to write a bit more about how much we're paying attention to what we've learned from human animal interaction research about training methods and behavior change procedures and how those affect our relationship with the animal, so with an individual. But that's a critical feature to attend to. So the model is, I hope, as science friendly as at least I tried to make it as science friendly as possible.
I love the emphasis on letting dogs do natural behavior where we can, or
Yeah.
I mean, as much as we reasonably can. Barking is
Yeah.
natural.
I've talked a bit now about function and the importance of function. That really, when we say function, we mean cause, right? Why did that behavior occur? And when we talk about a functional relation or a functional relationship, functional contingency, for instance, reinforcement, that just means that this consequence led to this change in behavior. So that's how reinforcement's defined functionally. So it's a cause, that's a causal relationship. And then we can talk about being effective. So we've got function, we've got the effective part, and effectiveness itself, if that's all we're using as our metric for success, is we just say, hey, I got this to occur, that can be a bit problematic, because we can sit there and say, well, I got the barking to stop. So, well, how'd you get the barking to stop? Well, I just kept yelling at the dog till they stopped barking, right? Or I kept doing this, X, Y, or Z. That we can talk about lots of things, especially many of the aversive consequences that can be delivered, many of the punishing procedures that are often used, that they can still be effective. But now when we start tying those two concepts together, and in the paper I talk a little bit of, I define both of these separately and then together, that now we're talking about being functionally effective, that we're identifying the reason why something occurs and using that understanding, our knowledge of the function of some behavior, to adequately apply some behavior change procedure that will be reward based to change that in some way. And that's what the behavioral sciences have done for half a century plus, that they've looked for identifying the function of some behavior and using that to guide reinforcement based procedures to change those behaviors. That's part of why people like Skinner have written so many books about the importance of function and the importance of reinforcement, that he tied those two together. So I'd like to say that the concept of functionally effective was something that I just came up with, but the reality is that no, it's very much something that has existed for a very long time in the behavioral sciences. And I just framed it this way that I hope makes it a bit more easy to understand and apply for animal trainers.
So if we're going back to the common issue of barking, maybe a dog is barking because they're bored, they don't have the energy release, and they're just trying to get it out or something. Maybe exercising them in the morning to really address that cause would serve to functional. Is that what you're saying? How would you state that? I want to make sure.
So if we're looking at something, and barking's always one of those tricky issues, because as you pointed out, dogs bark, and we do have to acknowledge that there is also a functionality to the behavior itself. So I'm using function also from the biological standpoint, because we can use function at both the level of behavior and biology, but understanding that there is a functionality to the behavior itself that's important. And so if that's our only purpose is to get rid of the behavior, maybe that's not functional for the dog. But we can say, okay, are there ways that we can find other things to increase, and that will itself lead to less of a reason for the barking to occur? So for instance, are there reasons why the barking's occurring that are a result of some of the things that we've already done? So are we inadvertently rewarding the dog for barking? And if so, can we place those rewards somewhere? So once we start to understand, once we take a step back, we look at, here's why the behavior is occurring. And therefore, if it is something, for instance, like we are rewarding, inadvertently rewarding barking for occurring, then we have a potential behavior change procedure we can implement now, which is, okay, so instead give attention for doing this. So give the dog attention for this instead of barking, and find ways that we can increase attention for other things. And in the process of that, probably also giving the dog itself more attention. We're talking about an animal, an individual that may work for getting attention under any condition, because they may be lacking some of that attention, that they want your attention in some way. And even yelling at them might be a form of attention. So again, all of that is part of understanding the function of the behavior and using that to help guide how then we change behavior and identify our success, our effectiveness. So that's the concept of functionally effective.
Could you give me another example? I mean, how the life model would be implemented, or the framework, or whatever you want to call it, in, say, a leash reactivity situation. Maybe a dog is, I understand underlying cause, that's very case by case for the individual dog. Do you have anything to say? Because I know that's a tough question, because reactivity can be tough for a lot of people.
Sure. And there you're getting at something that's really important, because you pointed out the individual component there, which these are things that are defined by the individual and their behavior, which I think is often a way that people it may have some difficulty with science in application too, as they often think of science as this thing that's like, I looked at 100 dogs, and then I produced an average of those 100 dogs. But I'm talking about, and this is the case for much of welfare science, it's focused on the individual. a lot of my research ends up being something that looks at an individual a lot of times for a long period of time. And so I'm still collecting lots of data, but the data is on an individual. And that's relevant, that's important, particularly for applied science, for welfare science. If you tell me, okay, well, this dog's being reactive, I'm going to say, okay, well, what does that look like? So let's identify some of the behaviors involved there. Let's operationally define this, or let's just specify the behaviors. So, well, I'm talking about my dog is lunging, he's barking in the presence of this other dog, or in the presence of this other person or something. I'm going to say, okay, so now we have some identifiable things that we can look at, and we have the individual that we're looking at it with. So let's start looking at if we can identify when it occurs. What are the things that happen before and after? And it may be, again, we could take at least one example where it could be inadvertent attention that's given for reacting, or it may be that they get away from an individual. So if the dog lunges, it pulls, jumps at. So let's go with the latter case, because I think that that's often something that we see where the dog may pull or jump at a dog, and what happens is the person maybe picks the dogs up or drags the dog away, but either way, they get the dog away from that situation as quickly as they can. So now we're starting to understand this potential escape function of the behavior. In that case, maybe we might want to try to use counter conditioning, even take a type of counter conditioning, systematic desensitization, that we might gradually expose and help remove some of that, so that we're getting less of a reason to escape the aversive. We might start including with that systematic desensitization procedure some positive reinforcement for the behaviors we do want to see. So some of the we could call more generally calm behaviors, but behaviors where it's not lunging, some of these things. And all of this, we're using the information that we figured out in identifying the function of the behavior to help guide how we then try to change, how we look to intervene on that behavior. So it's that two part of let's assess and then let's improve. And that's really the combination of being functionally effective. I think it sounds complicated because it's certainly there is complexity to that. But when we start in those small steps, and the first step is just saying, can we figure out why this is occurring? Can we look at what happened before and after? And are there ways that we can do that that might involve data? And then also keeping in mind ultimately that we're thinking about what effect all the things that we're doing have on the individual and our relationship with the individual. So that second and third component again, the welfare and human animal interaction part of that. And what does the science tell us about that?
Well said. That really is what this comes down to. It's not just about observable behavior. It's about the welfare of the dog. Because if
Yeah.
you neglect the welfare of a dog in exchange for suppressing a behavior, that may likely lead to other issues that people don't even put together, dog on dog
Mm.
aggression within the house. If you're continually, if you have multiple dogs, that could be a contributing factor, perhaps, right?
Yeah, certainly. And once we start thinking about the welfare component, it means we necessarily, when we're thinking about the individual, we've got to think about what's, quote unquote normal or natural for that animal as well. So that's another critical part that we start thinking. I mean, well, the welfare sciences aren't just about the effects of learning, but often there's considerable amount of consideration for the species itself and what's natural for that behavior. So it's this lovely combination of some of the evolutionary and learning histories of any individual that you take into consideration. And that's where thinking about things like barking come into play, because are you going to work with an Alaskan Husky and say, let's get rid of all vocalizations? I would hope not. what's part of their individual natural behavior. So that's something worth keeping in mind, and thinking about the individual and what's relevant for the welfare of that individual as well.
The acknowledgement and emphasis on the welfare of the animal, it's not just because it's nice, though it is. It's not just because it's
Yeah.
considerate of the animal, though it is, but it actually delivers, from what you're saying, a more desirable, better, well-rounded result for the guardian of the dog. Am I stating that as you would?
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's really well stated. So everyone ultimately that's trying to change behavior in some way, that's working with these individuals, they're typically thinking about the welfare of the individual. Most people are thinking, I want to make my dogs happy. I want to make these individuals happy. And I think when we start talking about what impact the different training procedures that we use, the different behavior change procedures, the different behavior management procedures we use, what impact that has on the welfare of the animal itself, on the individual, that's an important part that may not always be as obvious to someone. So they may just assume, oh, I have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
But so I have to. And that's often the way that we hear people describe the aversive training methods, the use of aversive tools, is it's something that you have to do, right?
Yes,
So,
it often is. Yeah, yeah. But hopefully, if we can, get some of this science in this unregulated field of dog training, then we could potentially, resolve a lot of these issues. That's one of the things we advocate for, Bree and I, is so the public is more protected on this, and not giving their
yeah,
hard dollars to dog trainers who are omitting various aspects of welfare, like you're talking about.
right.
A lot of times we hear people say that the LIMA model puts the person first or the handler first. And so the argument goes something like, there are times where you basically have to choose. Like, sure, it would be great to always think of the welfare of the dog, but sometimes you have to consider the handler for a variety of reasons, whether it's like
Yeah,
a handler or a person in a difficult situation where they can't necessarily accommodate their dog in a big city with a reactive dog, etc. And
right.
that's something that we think about a whole lot because based on the evidence we've seen, it seems like that doesn't really put the person first. It seems like putting the animal's welfare first actually puts the person first.
When people say, well, I have to consider the welfare of the handler first, and they do something, it's often as an excuse, I think, in many cases, to then say, and then therefore I did this awful thing, or did this thing that I wouldn't normally do. But the reality is, well, wait a second, but where are you choosing to do that thing? And is it really, as you pointed out, does that really, if would not choosing that thing be better for the welfare of the animal, for the individual, and the trainer, right? So the dog and the guardian. And I think once we start framing things in terms of the welfare of the dog, the welfare of the individual, that becomes a bit more clear.
So true. I mean, that is the missing link in my view and your view. It sounds like that if you put welfare first, then that you're going to have a lot less issues, and exercising the dog, making sure their diet's right,
Yeah.
making sure everything in their life is as optimal as you can create for them.
Yeah, it kind of does put the person first to do that.
Well, yeah.
It helps eliminate some of those arguments where somebody wants to say something like, well, but you have to do this. You have to do that. You go, wait, well, why do I have to? Well, because otherwise the animal won't, X, Y, or Z won't respect you, will do what it wants, will do that. And he's ultimately, when you stop and you say, okay, well, but where's your evidence for that?
Right. Is this an
And
anecdote? Is this, yeah,
right.
what's going
Is
on?
this so? I get that this is your opinion about that, but where's your evidence for that? Because let's go to what we do know. And when you look at what we do know, it often shows the opposite. So doing those things is more detrimental, particularly when we look at the welfare effects on the animal. We see things, and just like again, you'll have to throw that particular reference, which I believe is O'Handley, I said
Oh,
2020,
sure.
where they looked at cats and their so cat guardians, cat owners, and their and aggression. But that one is a great example where they were able to show that the people that were using the more aversive methods, so using spray bottles, were the ones producing the most aggression. Yet I'm sure somebody told them this is the only way your cat's going to respect you is if you spray it when it does that, or something like that. Yet they're producing the most aggression. And
Mhm.
there's lots and lots of evidence of this, of the fact that using aversives, there's this idea of aggression breeding aggression. And that's been shown time and time again in the laboratory, in the field, so in applied settings across a variety of species, that uh, we see that happen quite often.
Real well said. I think this is a good stopping point. I still have another like 7 or 8 questions, but I'd rather save this for another time. And I appreciate that. I know you're certainly willing to.
That's true. I like
Yeah.
these other questions though. So can let's actually do a round 2 if we can.
Yeah.
These are good. I like
Yeah.
Got to keep the audience wanting more, right? Dr. Eduardo Fernandez, Eddie, honor of a lifetime to have you here. And I know that your words are going to provide so much value. I want to do everything I can to amplify messages and lessons learned from people like you who dedicate their lives to this. So thank you
Yeah.
so much for everything.
The pleasure is all mine. This is fantastic. And I look forward to part 2.
Ah, absolutely.
Me too.